Jesus, in one of the accounts in Matthew 18, will talk about the reason that he uses a child as an example is because of the humility that his disciples were not demonstrating on that occasion. Peaceful, and it's also in Matthew chapter 18, is that the disciples are arguing about which one of them is the greatest. And a lot of the turmoil that we have that exists among brethren, especially a lasting type of turmoil, is often because we don't have a childlike spirit and we lack the childlike ability to forgive and move on from things. And also hopeful. A child goes to bed at night and he basically forgets everything that happened the day before. And so he wakes up every morning like that's a brand new day, maybe even like the first day he's ever been on the face of the earth. And that hopefulness that he has and that joy and peacefulness that he has throughout that day is something that we sometimes lose because we know that each day has its own troubles. And we face it as a day full of trouble instead of something of new experiences. And so that's the three words that we're going to be looking at this morning. But there in Mark chapter 10, verses 13 through 16, Jesus does have these children that are being brought to him. So I want you to think about for just a moment and fill in the blank. Children are blank. Some people went. Some people smiled and some people said, yeah, I'm not answering that one. Children are what? Defenseless? Children are undependable. Children are not profitable. Children are a devourer of time. Children are needy. Children are whiny. Children complain. Children are what God says the people in the kingdom are supposed to be like. And so when you start thinking about children, there's a lot of different characteristics about children that make the world in general look upon them as being, as some of those words that I used, as being really not of profit. They're going to take up a lot of your time. And we even say that this person or this couple used to be really involved with all these other things, but then they had kids. And we know that for the next 18 plus years, we're probably not going to see them very much. But other people, when they look at children, they recognize the great potential that is there. When Jesus is writing these things, it's in the midst of a culture that looked upon children as being something that were going to be highly dependent upon their parents until such a time that they could yield some type of profit or aid or comfort to the family in general. And it was only at that point that they really seemed to be a productive member of society. And we sometimes will have that point of view, but we kind of go and skew the opposite direction most of the time, that we put children on a high enough plane to where they seem to be more important than the parents that are there. And so it's important for us to understand that when Jesus is saying these things, many people did not look at children as being an important and valuable part of society. And so when Jesus has these children that are being brought to him in Mark chapter 10, and his disciples do not say, well, maybe you should let the master, tend to his affairs right now and not bother him right now. No, they rebuked them. They openly chastised and scolded these people about how they should know better than bothering Jesus at this time. Remember in Mark chapter 10, Jesus is teaching on the subject of divorce and remarriage. And it's in the midst of that these people are bringing children. We know of other times, like in Luke chapter 12, where this man in the crowd interrupts Jesus' teaching by saying, tell my brother to divide inheritance with me. And we say how out of place and strange and odd that was. Well, here you have something similar. But notice Jesus' reaction. Jesus' reaction, and I appreciate Chris's translation because it's really good. The New King James that I use says that he was greatly displeased. Other versions use the word, which is a much better word. He was indignant. The word that's used there is only used just over a handful of times in the entire New Testament. This is the only time that it's ascribed to Jesus. And what it means is violently emotional about it. Jesus was violently emotional about the fact that they were rebuking these people for bringing the children to him. Earlier in Mark chapter 9, and this is in Mark chapter 9 is a parallel to Matthew chapter 18, you'll have that Jesus is going to actually have a child brought to him. Tells a child to come to him. Here these children are being brought to Jesus. So Jesus, this is not the first time that Jesus has told his disciples that citizens of the kingdom are supposed to be like little children, and they're still not getting the point, and they're still rebuking people for bringing the children to him. And Jesus has to once again tell them, this is what the kingdom of heaven is supposed to look like, this little child. So what does that mean? What does that have for us? The only other time that Jesus has showed this type of emotion that I'm aware of in the scriptures is probably back when Jesus first began his ministry, and he goes into the temple, and he sees that there are people who are exchanging money in the temple. And Jesus makes a whip of cords and drives them out. At that time, you can understand Jesus probably being highly, violently emotional about that situation and bringing himself under control as he sets out there and makes a whip of cords that he's going to use very shortly. But that's how strongly Jesus wants to emphasize this fact that we're supposed to be like little children when it comes to the kingdom. So what does that mean? So what I want us to do is to look at some of the characteristics of a child and the faith that a child has and the confidence and the love and the peace and the joy and the happiness that a child has, and where does that come from? And also to look at this from this perspective, that if you have children that you are raising, by instilling these types of principles in your child, they will grow up happy, joyful, peaceful, hopeful, confident, without fear, risk takers, things such as that we always value as being productive members of the Lord's kingdom. One of the things that's first and foremost is this idea of trust. You know, one of the things that I have seen is a dad taking their child, this small child, and tossing them in the air. And not just slightly in the air, but really, really high in the air. And when I see other dads do that, it freaks me out. But I did it to my own kids. Because after all, I knew I was going to catch them. I don't know what you're going to do with your kid, but I caught my kid. And mothers are always freaked out by that. But if you think about how the kid is reacting to that, they're giggling and laughing, and there's no fear involved in that when that dad takes that child and throws them in the air. It's only later when they've had a few falls and they've seen dad drop a few things that they say, okay, that's enough of that. But at the very beginning, that's not the way it is. You remember that when God spoke to Israel and they're in captivity and they're going through some hardship and some difficulty because of the sin that existed. In Jeremiah, God tells his people, I know the plans that I have for you. They're plans for peace. They're plans for prosperity. They're plans for good things for you. I'm not putting you through this turmoil. I'm not putting you through this trouble because I want something bad to happen to you, but because I want something good to happen to you. That the trust that a child has for their parents is that trust that understands that, yes, dads, moms are going to do things with us that are very, very fun, and they may be dangerous things, but they're not doing these things because they're planning to hurt us. They're planning for good things, for wonderful things, to build something in us. And then even later, when it comes to things like discipline, the child is supposed to learn to trust the parent, that they're disciplining me, they're chastising me, they may be corporally punishing me because they want to instill within me trust, that I know they're going to be there. And that's one of the things that authority in the home does. It builds trust, it builds confidence, it builds security for that child because they know no matter what, good times or bad, the parent's still going to be very consistent with whatever it is they do with them in the home. In Psalm 139, in verses 23 and 24, and there's so many Psalms that are directed to God in the form of prayer. And in Psalm 139, verses 23 and 24, one of the things that trust will build is this. Here David says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties, and see if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. One of the things that trust will cultivate is openness and honesty. That you know that a child is extremely honest with what they believe anyway. They're extremely honest. If they are angry, they tell you. If they are sad, they tell you. If they're hungry, even from the time they're born, they tell you. And they let you know with no uncertain terms, look, I'm coming to you with this because you need to take care of it. Because you're the parent. David here is telling God, search me and try me, know me. Find out if there's something in me that needs to be there. As adults, we lose that simplicity. We lose that trust. And when we go to God in prayer, we're not like David was in so many of his prayers. When David would approach God, and these are prayers that bother my mind from time to time as well. David will go to God in prayer and say, God, I am mad, I am angry, and I am confused. I do not know why you are not taking care of me. I don't know why you're not watching over me right now, but these people are my enemies, and they are doing me wrong. God, this is what I want. I want you to break their teeth. This is what I want. That's a pretty honest prayer. That's the way that a child talks to the parent. I don't know why you're not getting on my sister right now, but I wish you'd just break her teeth. And that's how they feel. And it may not be right because we are childlike in those types of things. But we need to be honest with our God. He knows what is there. And in our prayers, we need to trust Him enough to know how to help us and how to remedy whatever that situation is. We need to understand that God is indeed the one who is watching over us, that He is the one who is always there. And we need to be willing in our prayers to always say to God, your will be done, thy will be done in all things, knowing that God is watching over us. You've probably heard the illustration before about this young boy that was trapped in the upstairs of their home when a fire had broke out. The father and the rest of the family had made it out the front door, but the little child is still in the upper window. And the father is yelling to his child, jump, I will catch you. Jump, I will catch you. And the child says, I'm afraid, Daddy. I'm afraid to jump. I don't want to jump. There's too much smoke. I can't see you. And the father says, yes, but I can see you. And he tells the child to jump because I can see you. Because that's the most important part. And when we talk about trusting God, that's what it's really all about, is there's times where I don't know what it is that God would want me to do. I don't know what the right situation or what right solution for my situation may be, but I need to trust in Him that He's there to see me. These are the kinds of things that build confidence and trust in a child. We teach our children, Matthew 7:24-28, that the wise man builds his house upon the rock. The rains come, and it doesn't matter how high the floods go. It doesn't matter how much the wind blows. That house is going to stand that is built upon the rock. And we teach them that from a very young age. And it's because when we send them out into the world, we want them to know, look, you do what it is that God wants you to do, and you're going to be just fine. You do what God wants you to do, and you will be just fine. The world may kill you. You do what God wants you to do, and you will be just fine. That's the lesson that we have from that. And so when we turn to Romans chapter 8, and we see in verses 31-39 where Paul makes this great discourse about the way in which nothing can separate us from the love of God. And we read through that, and it's a crescendo of just a building voices of victory about this faith and this confidence and walking by faith and walking according to the dictates of the Spirit is all about, and how it is that nothing, whether it's death or life, principalities or powers, doesn't matter how great and wonderful something else may be, nothing can separate us from the love of God. That is not because Paul had gained so much intellectual assets in his life, so much as it was he had learned to trust everything that God had said. That's the point, is that yes, faith comes from understanding, learning what it is that God has said. Romans 10:17. That's where faith comes from. But that in and of itself is not faith. Faith means trusting everything that God has said. That every time God says something, I trust it, I believe it, I follow it, and I know that no matter how high God may throw me in the air, He's going to catch me. That's the point. And so if we want to build and cultivate courage, trust, confidence in our children, the wise man built his house on the rock. That's where it comes from, and that's what we never need to lose. But also when you think about children, children are highly dependent upon their parents, because the parents are their guardians. And it's interesting that when Jesus finishes in Matthew 23 this chapter of rebuking the children of Israel for not, especially the scribes and the Pharisees, for not understanding who He was, for violating the different principles of God, that at the very end of that, Jesus makes this statement as He's weeping over Jerusalem, how often I would have gathered you as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Jesus says, I wanted to be your protector. I wanted to be your guardian. I wanted to be the one who took you in and protected you and spread my wings over you, but you weren't willing to do that. And as children, that's sometimes what happens in children of the kingdom, that we forget about our dependency on God, that we think we are the ones who have done everything, that we are the ones who have accomplished making it to this certain station in life. Even in the spiritual realm, we think that, instead of attributing these things to God's majesty and His glory. In James chapter 4, there the author reminds us that we are to always be about understanding, that it doesn't matter about what we're planning to do. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go to this place or that place, we'll buy and sell and make a profit. And James points out that what you ought to be saying is, if the Lord wills. Because when you boast like that, James says it's evil. It's not because he's saying that if you make plans, plans are evil. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that if you don't make your plans according to understanding that God is the one who decides what we ought to be and ought to be not doing in our life, that if we don't take God into consideration when we make our plans, then I'm just going to do this and I'm going to build for myself these barns, and I'm going to say to my soul, take your ease and have many years of ease, that God can say to you, you fool. Today your soul's going to be required of you. And then who are these things going to belong to? If we forget God because of our plans, we've lost that childlike heart. We've lost that childlike faith. A child knows that it's according to the parents where we go, what we do, or how we accomplish things, though they may have many plans of their own. In Matthew chapter 6, you remember that Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, talks about the way in which we can only serve one master. And at the very beginning of this particular discourse, in Matthew chapter 6 and starting at verse 19, Jesus says, not to lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. But this is the thing, that adults learn something that children don't understand. We learn the value of worrying. We learn and we teach the importance of worrying. And we do it this way. God says don't worry, but He doesn't say to be concerned. Because we're supposed to be concerned with our food and our clothing and our shelter. Because if you're not concerned with your family's food, it means you don't care about your family. If you're not concerned about their clothing, you don't love your family. If you're not concerned about their housing, you don't love your family. And you're not fulfilling your role as an adult. And so we treat concern like it's this little pill, this little bit of medicine that you need to have that will keep you from being full of apathy, full of unconcern, full of doubt. And we say, you need to be concerned. But what happens is we take that little pill that's supposed to make us be responsible adults, and it becomes an addiction. And that addiction is called worry. That's what happens when we lose a childlike faith. Jesus, when He's saying this about not worrying, it does mean don't be overly concerned. But how concerned are the plants after all? How concerned are the birds after all? How concerned are all these things? Is Jesus saying, yes, I want you to be just enough concerned to where you're taking the drug, but you're not addicted to it? Or is Jesus saying, look, your Father's going to take care of you? We know how it is when we've passed the collection plate and we take $1 out of our wallet and we give it to our child so that our child can learn to give these things back to God. That child does not take that dollar and say, you know what, I need to be concerned because next week I want to buy a toy. And next week I need a piece of candy. And next week Dad might lose his job. And next week Mom may need some help because she's been put in the hospital and she may have some medical bills. That child doesn't look at that $1 bill and start divvying it up. That child takes that $1 bill and he puts it in the collection plate. And the reason being is because they're not attached to it. They have no concern for it. And the reason they have no concern for it is because they know they're not living by that dollar they were just given. They're living because of their parents who gave it to them. When we give it back to God, that's exactly the same idea and the same principle. I'm not attached to that. That is not my treasure. That's not where my heart is. And I'm able to give it back to God freely because God gave it to me and He's taking care of me. That's why we're supposed to have that childlike spirit and that childlike faith. You remember the widow with her 2 mites? This widow in Mark's account in chapter 12 is a poor widow woman. That's what Jesus describes her as. And she put in out of all that she had. She put in all she had. The rich gave some, that's great. But she gave all that she had because she wasn't attached to that. The point is this. Paul says this in Philippians chapter 4. I know how to be abased. I know how to abound. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And so in that whole chapter, when he ends with that, he begins with the idea, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Don't be anxious for anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known to God. Do this with thanksgiving. And you remember we went through chapter 4, verse 8 about all these other things that we ought to be meditating upon. And how much easier is it for us to not worry and not be concerned and have peace and have comfort in our lives and understand our true dependency on God when we're focusing on all the things that God has given to us. That child doesn't look at that dollar that you give them and say, that's great, they gave me $1, I'm happy about that. But I'm going to hold on to it because maybe they're not going to let me have a bedroom when I get back home. Maybe they're not going to let me ride in the car when we go back home. Maybe they're going to turn off the air conditioner and not let me use that. Maybe I'm never going to take another trip to McDonald's. They don't think that way. The parents are there. They understand their dependency. And because of that, it is a tremendous source of joy. That's where truly recognizing value comes from. Recognizing value doesn't come from necessarily having and losing so much as it is understanding dependency on someone else, especially our God. And that's the kind of dependency we should always have. Humility as well. In Matthew 18, I made reference to this a few times, but let's read this account. Matthew chapter 18. Matthew chapter 18 and the parallels there in Mark chapter 9. And so this is prior to what Jesus says to his disciples that we read in Mark chapter 10. But in Matthew chapter 18, at that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Then Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, "Surely I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Here you have this account where Jesus has a child and tells the child to come to him. And this child, in the midst of all these disciples, in the midst of the discussions that's going on, in the midst of understanding that he's probably there because his parents have come to listen to this teacher named Jesus, maybe have even known of some of the miracles and who Jesus was, but Jesus says, "Come here, child." And that child comes. You know why that child obeys? Because he understands his true position in life. He understands his true station in life. That's what humility is all about. One of the greatest commandments, and really one of the first commandments that you teach your child that is one of the most valuable, if not the most valuable, is that when you call their name, they come to you. That's really one of the first things they need to learn. When I call, you come. That teaches humility. That teaches obedience. The reason that we find it so hard to be obedient is because we've lost humility. Because of pride. Who are you to be telling me? After all, who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? You're not any better than me in the kingdom. And by doing that, what I'm actually saying is, I'm probably better than you in the kingdom. Because who are you to be telling me? So they come to Jesus and they're asking the question, so who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus says, whoever's the most humble, whoever's like a child. And Jesus even goes further than that and says, if you don't become like this child, you are not going to enter the kingdom of heaven. And this is his disciples he's talking to. You want to be part of God's kingdom? You better lose that pride. You better come when I call you and stop this bickering that's going on among you. Because we know how it was in our own households, and us fathers, we know how it's supposed to be in our households too. Daddy will end the argument. Brother and sister fighting over something, Daddy will end that argument. And Daddy will let both of you know neither one of you is any better than the other. And you're my children. And this is not going to be acceptable among my children. I don't care what you're arguing about. This is not acceptable. You need to be humble. You're arguing over a toy. Guess where the toy goes? It goes on top of the refrigerator, and you don't get it. Either one of you. And so in James chapter 4, I think you have a very vivid example of this, that James in James chapter 4 is talking about this war that exists among the brethren there. Where do these wars and fighting come from? They come because you're coveting, you're murdering, you're trying to take from your brethren by force these different things, probably these different stations like teachers and such. And what James says is the reason you don't have is because you don't ask. You don't learn how to share. You don't learn how to ask of your brother or your sister or of your father for these things. You want to just take it from them, and that's not right. But then when you do ask, you don't get it. And the reason you don't get it when you ask is because you want to spend it on your own pleasure, and God's not going to give it to you. And so he tells them that they are to lament and mourn and weep, that they are to understand that this is something that draws enmity between themselves and God, but God is going to exalt the humble, but he's going to bring low the one who is proud. Isn't that the way that we do it in our own households? We don't allow our children to exalt themselves against one another. We don't allow them to take from one another by force. We teach them they should ask for these things. And if they're asking for these things just so that they can keep their brother or sister from having them, no, you're not going to get that. Because you're wanting it for yourself and you're not thinking of others that's there. And so we have this humility that Jesus, I believe, is pointing to that did not exist among his brethren, among his disciples. In Ephesians chapter 4, parents, think about this. Is this not what we teach our children? God is here speaking to his children, and even it emphasizes in chapter 5, verse 1, therefore, at the end of what we're about to read, be imitators of God as dear children. Put away lying. Don't lie to each other. Verse 26, understand you're angry. It's okay to be angry, but never act that way. In verse 27, don't give the devil an opportunity. Don't let something be brought between you and your brothers and sisters. Don't take from them. Verse 28, let him who stole steal no longer. If you want something, here's a good way to obtain it. Let's do some chores around the house. Let's start keeping our allowance and put some of that aside so that you can buy the things that you want. Don't take them from others. Verse 29, be careful about what you say. Don't let corrupt words proceed out of your mouth. When we speak to one another in this house, we're going to be kind to each other. We're going to be giving words that give forethought before we speak to others. Don't make your parents angry. Don't grieve the Holy Spirit of God. Verse 31, don't be bitter. Don't show wrath. Don't be angry. Put away clamor, evil speaking. Put away malice. What we do in this house is we are kind to one another. We're tender-hearted. We forgive each other because this is what your parents understand. God forgave me as your father so many different things. So I should never hold a grudge against someone else. I should always be willing to forgive. And if God was that way with me after all the things that I've done to him, then you should be able to forgive your brother, your sister, and to be kind to them. That's the instructions that we teach our children as they're growing up. Jesus wants us to never lose that. This is where tenderness, this is where kindness, this is where benevolence, this is where all these good, wonderful graces come from when we have this humility that a child has. A child, when they share it all, and they don't hold back. And that's the way that we're supposed to be as well. A child's sense of amazement is a wonderful thing. As I said at the very beginning, a child wakes up each day and they forget about all the different things that happened the night before, it seems. And every day is like a brand new day. And they are just simply amazed by all they see because it's like they've seen it for the first time. And for them, it may be the first time they've ever seen that. Some of you have probably seen that YouTube video that went around about this child, these two children that the parents were actually wanting to play a trick on at it was either birthday or Christmas time. And this child is sitting there, and it's an English family, a British family, and they're sitting there, and the child opens it up, and they get a banana. And they're like, oh, what a wonderful banana. And she's just thrilled about this banana. that was supposed to be a joke. But the child was in amazement that their parents loved them enough to give them a banana. Wow. You know how it is when they do open up boxes that have their toys and things in it? And the toys thrown in the corner, and what do they play with? The box. Because it's not about the value, the price tag that was there. They're in amazement. Have you seen this box? Look what I can do. I can get inside this box. I can put this box on top of me. I can sit in this box and Daddy can pull me around the house in it like it's a car. I can take this box and I can take other boxes and build a huge fort out of it. Yes, the toy's great, Dad, but look at the box. And that amazement and that wonder is there. In Lamentations chapter 3, and Lamentations means this lamenting, this mourning, this weeping about all these horrible things that are happening to God's people, and how Jeremiah the prophet is being put through all sorts of horrible things because of prophesying to the people. And here in the midst of this, in Lamentations chapter 3, it's because of God's mercy and His grace we are not consumed. And then in verse 23, he makes this statement: the mercies of the Lord, the grace of our God, these wonderful things that God gives to us, He renews these things every morning. Every morning. A child wakes up most of the time and they are ready for the day, even before the parents are. They don't need coffee. They're ready. And they're ready to face that joy, that day, and they are full of joy and they're full of vigor most of the time. In the Psalm 59, one example of the childlike faith that we ought to be developing that's along those same lines, the amazement of each day, is Psalm 59, verses 16 and 17. Psalm 59, 16 and 17. Here it says, "But I will sing of your power. Yes, I will sing aloud of your mercy in the morning. For you have been my defense and my refuge in the day of my trouble. To you, O my strength, I will sing praises. For God is my defense, my God of mercy." How many songs have your children made up either in the dead of night or in the early morning, and they are singing at the top of their lungs, and it's just whatever is in their mind at that moment? And they do that because of the joy that is there within them, the amazement that is there in them. Something hit them that struck a chord. Oh, I love my box that the toy came in, or whatever it may be, and they are happy. Why do we teach them to lose that? The psalmist says, in the morning, I'm going to sing about your power. I'm going to sing about how glorious and wonderful you are. Brethren, the amazement. What does a simple amount of faith do? Jesus said, the faith of a mustard seed moves mountains. If you had faith of a mustard seed, what could you do? If you had enough faith to go to someone else and say to them, I love you, and I want to sit down with you, and I want to study from God's Word with you, because I want to spend all of eternity with you. Something as simple as that, what could be accomplished by that? The amazement that is there. What about the amazement when you see someone who says, you know what, I understand. I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. I've had my doubts, I've had my fears, I've had different things that was keeping me from it, but I believe with all my heart that Jesus is the Son of God. And I want to be baptized for the remission of my sins. And we'll sit in an audience such as this maybe, and we'll see them go up into the waters of baptism. It's such a simple act of being immersed in water and coming up, and the amazement. We just saw a birth take place. That someone who was in the world is no longer there. And God took them and placed them into His kingdom. And God didn't place them into His kingdom just so He could turn them loose and let them be in the world all by themselves. No, He brought them into the kingdom so that He might watch over them, protect them. And everything to them, as Paul says, has become new. All things. That amazement we should never lose, because that's what it truly means to be a child of God. That amazement is so valuable, and we should never lose it. In Matthew chapter 14, we have the account where Jesus is going to send the crowds away that He's been teaching. But He tells His disciples to get into the boat and go on ahead of Him. He'll catch up. And so as they get out there on the sea, Jesus sends the crowd away. He spends some time in prayer. And while they're out there, the boat is met with ferocious winds and waves and things such as that. And Jesus, according to Mark's account, not only goes out there on the water, walking on the water, but Jesus wasn't planning on getting in the boat. Mark's account says, and he would have just passed them on by. So if you're in the boat and you see Jesus walking on the water, and he's not going to get in the boat, he's just going to pass you on by, would you not be amazed? And like a child, would you not be, that's a ghost. People don't do that. That's a ghost. And Jesus says to them, don't be afraid. It's me. And Peter, like a child, full of amazement, says, well, if that's you, let me walk on the water too. Jesus says, well, come on in. And Peter gets out of the boat and starts walking. Me and Andrew were talking about this situation the other day. If I was one of the other disciples, would I have also said, well, if Peter can do it, I can do it too. Let me come out there. Or would I have been afraid in the boat with the rest of them? I don't know. But the amazement of Peter to want to do that, I want to do that. Children don't have that fear that we have. I want to do that. Let me try. Well, no, you can't do that. You can't ride that roller coaster. It says you have to be this tall, and you're only this tall. You can't get on it. Sorry. They want to. They're not afraid because they're full of amazement. But it's when Peter saw the situation that he was in that it made him afraid, and he began to sink. There was a coach one time that was trying to teach his team about getting rid of fear and how it is that fear is a horrible enemy of competition when it's not used properly. And he said, look, we've trained and we've trained and we've trained. You need to trust your training. And so what he does is he takes this 2x4, and it's not laid on its edge, it's laid flat. And he takes this 2x4 that he lays flat on the floor, and he tells all of his team, I want you to walk heel to toe across this 2x4. And they all one after another, heel to toe, they walk across it, no problem whatsoever. It's easy. And so then he takes that same 2x4 and he puts it on top of a 10-foot ladder. And he says, okay, now do it. And nobody wanted to. Same task, different environment. Did they really have faith in their abilities? What happens most of the time is that we're in the safety and confines of our local congregation or our family or the brethren that we're closest to. And we're confident about standing up for the truth, speaking what is real. Put us in a different environment, though, where we're really tested, we lose confidence. See, the faith was not in the fact that, yes, I can walk across that board so much as it was there's no danger if I fall. That's where the faith was. We need to be more confident in what God is able to do and not lose that sense of amazement that we have in what God is able to do. And lastly, a child's faith is something that's highly impressionable. There in Matthew chapter 18, if you're still there, Matthew chapter 18, verses 5 and 6, Jesus, at the conclusion of this idea of speaking about children here, he says in verse 5, whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. And then he says something very, very strong in verse 6. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Jesus, who so loved the world that he came to give his life. Jesus, who was full of compassion and mercy. Jesus, who said to the crowds, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden. Jesus, who wept because of the ones who were lost. This same Jesus said, it would be better if a millstone were hung around your neck and you were cast into the midst of the sea. Because children are highly impressionable. And we need to understand about the imprint that we're making on our children's lives by the things that we teach them and by the example that they see. They are a reflection of who we are. Most studies say, and these are studies, so take them for what it's worth, but most studies say by about the age of 4 or 5 that your son will react to his mother in the same fashion that he comprehends you as the father reacting to the mother. And so if they're back-talking a lot to the mother, it may be because they don't see you respecting the mother. if they'll lash out and strike at their mother at that age, especially with the boys at that age, it's because they've seen that you haven't shown any respect toward her most of the time. With girls, it's the same way. They're a reflection of the way in which they see the mothers reacting to the father. And it's a dangerous thing if we lose sight of that and how impressionable they truly are. In Matthew 10 and verse 16, Matthew 10 verse 16, Jesus tells his disciples, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents, but harmless as doves." We are so very careful about teaching our children that they're supposed to be wise when they go into the world, that they're supposed to use discretion when they go into the world. The world is a rough place. This is a difficult place. You're going to be met with some hard times. The world's going to throw you against the wall, and all of that is true. But we also need to be teaching them to be harmless as doves, to not lose that childlike faith, that childlike trust. The wise man built his house on the rock. Do what God tells you to do, and you're going to be fine. Even in the midst of this hard world, you're going to be fine. Just do what God tells you to do. You are more than conquerors through him who loved you. Be wise as a serpent, but be harmless as a dove. Make sure we teach both parts of that to our children. In Proverbs 29 and verse 15, it says, "The rod and rebuke give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother." Take the time. Jesus took the time with these children. He took the time to tell his disciples, look, I know I'm talking about some pretty deep, meaty topics right now. Matthew 19, Mark chapter 10, meaty topics. Marriage, divorce, and remarriage. How deep is that for so many people? And yet he still took the time. And so he was indignant. He was angry with his disciples when they lost track of that. In Matthew 22 and verse 39, it tells them, Jesus tells this lawyer what the greatest of the commandments are. And the second one is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. We're supposed to take the time to teach them how to love, even in the midst of a rough world. The point is this: Jesus warns his disciples, do not corrupt the innocence of a young, impressionable disciple. But as parents, this is a lesson we can learn as well. Do not corrupt the innocence of that young and impressionable child that's in your home. Teach them wisdom, but teach them to honor, respect, and trust God even more. The wise man built his house on the rock. Do what he tells you to do, and you're going to be just fine. That's the point of the lesson. And so that's the question I want to leave with you this morning is, do you long for a childlike faith? The times that I look back where I've been disappointed, I think a lot of it can be linked back to this. I'm so afraid of what's about to happen. I'm so worried about what the situations are going to be. I didn't have faith in my ability to walk across this board. I had faith in the fact that the circumstances weren't consequential. And because of that, I didn't act or I didn't react the way that God would have me to do. Oh, for a childlike faith. That's what we need to have. And so if that's something that you're longing for this morning, if that's something that we can help you with this morning, if that's something that you need some guidance in and teaching your children with, we can help you in all these things. And let's stand together as we try to honor God by doing these things. As together we stand and sing, won't you please come if we can help.